Got ourselves a batch of shinies, Commander.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Coordinated Fire, Episode 26, a Star Wars Shatterpoint podcast where we embrace what might seem to be chaos because we know it's really the will of the Force. How are you doing, Kyle?
Ooh, it's almost like we might be talking about variance and statistics in this episode.
Yeah, well, we got rid of Sean, so we know that the two of us are very statistic-oriented people. We didn't actually get rid of Sean. He's still around. He just couldn't make it.
Yeah, no Sean for this evening. Titus, you play a game lately?
I have. So on Thursday, our usual weekly game, I played Veers Krennic again against Ryan, who was doing the smart thing and prepping for his draft team, and he played Grievous Maul. I unfortunately I don't have my Ewoks built yet, and I got home at like 6 o'clock, so I just couldn't get that stuff together. Veers and Krennic were already in the box. So yeah, I just played the list I've been having fun with lately. So Ryan's list was Grievous Maul Separatists specifically. So core box Separatists plus the Grievous box. And they just don't compare to the modern Stormtroopers, like the Death Troopers and Shore Troopers. Like it made me very sad because the game felt very much decided based on unit quality.
I think a lot of people view the Stormtroopers aren't quite there from a viability standpoint, and this still wasn't super comparable.
I don't know. People are still pretty hot on Death Troopers, and then the Shore Troopers are not quite as popular, but there's definitely a dedicated group of people
that are both excellent support.
Think they're good, but like B1s, B2s, they don't keep up, and it sucks because the rest of that list was actually pretty good, but the supports, it was night and day in terms of unit quality, and it couldn't keep up.
Yeah, I think...
Kyle, what about you? What have you been up to?
I was going to say, I think Ryan's conclusion was a bit of a change up in his game plan for what his draft list is going to look like after this.
Yeah, I mean, I still think there's some cool stuff you could do with his. It is an incredibly lethal set of primaries.
Top to bottom.
Yep.
It absolutely is.
But yeah, what have you been up to?
What have I been doing?
Yeah.
I wish I could tell you I played some Shatterpoint. I went with the intent to play Shatterpoint, and then we didn't communicate who all was bringing terrain, and it was a minor inconvenience for someone to get terrain. So Josh and I played Riftbound while you and Ryan played Shatterpoint, and I've been playing a lot of Riftbound. It's been fun to play a TCG again. That's been a long time for me. It's a super cool game that unfortunately is very sold out everywhere and difficult to get product as TCGs go these days, but it's been fun to dip into something different. I really like ground floor of games. It is my favorite time to play any game, just when it's fresh and new and everyone's building up some hype. So
I will say the first couple sets of TCGs are always like the best time, in my opinion, because you don't have that just massive amount of a card pool to have to learn when everybody else already knows it. And the power level tends to be a lot more basic.
Yeah.
I have to say, I'm looking forward to trying some out, but
it's been fun. I know Sean's been dabbling a bit too, so I'm excited for this one. But this is not a Riftbound podcast. This is a Shatterpoint.
No, and it's not going to become one. We're sticking with Shatterpoint. That's don't anybody worry.
No, my tiny Star Wars figures are not going anywhere. But we are going to talk about something TCG adjacent.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about the cool deck of cards that comes with your Shatterpoint list every time you play.
Could you imagine having a 7-card TCG deck? That would I don't know how you would do that.
This is variance, kind of.
Yes. So we're talking, of course, about the order deck. This has been a topic that was requested a few times. I know people always have some questions about it. So we're going to talk about the order deck. To start with, I think we should actually just talk about what makes the order deck unique in terms of tabletop war games, because I know a lot of us do come from some experience of wargaming, some more than others. But if you're just getting into Shatterpoint, or even you've been playing Shatterpoint for a while, but it's the only war game you've played, it might not be immediately obvious why there's a bit of a stigma about having this style of activation. So
Yeah,
we'll
I
start with
know.
that.
Yeah, I think the order deck when Shatterpoint first launched, I think was one of kind of the biggest talking points on how this game works, right? And I think you saw both sides of the camp. You saw the camp that was like, I absolutely love this. This feels fresh. This feels new. And I think adds a really cool dynamic. But then you had the complete opposite side that, this is jarring. I don't feel in control. I don't feel like I can go in with a game plan, and definitely put some people off in the initial phase. And I think a lot of those kind of warmed up as we saw how the game developed. But in short, it on one hand takes away a bit of agency from the player in deciding which unit or which character you're going to activate this turn, which almost every miniature games do. I would say all other miniature games, but I'm sure someone would throw an obscure game that I have not played or heard of that has
Yeah.
a different kind of mechanic for random
X-Wing's
activations.
a little bit of a hybrid because, like, you have initiative numbers, but they're concrete. They always stay the same.
But this adds in this, you can't go in with your perfect opening combo. You can't go in with, this is how I'm going to open every time I play this mission or this objective set. You have a level of variance and unknown to your order of activations. Now, there's some very cool ways to mitigate that exist throughout the game, which we'll definitely touch on a few aspects. But overall, at a base level, your assumption going into a game of Shatterpoint is you have a 1 in 7 or a 14% chance at opening deck of flipping any unit in your list.
Yep. And that can be very relevant for some lists that really want that specific unit on their open. I mean, the big ones would be things like Boss or Iden. Yeah, having Kalani in the core set was the big one for a long time, where it's like, hey, I really want to start with Kalani. But you can't always get that
Kalani
because
opening
we
felt so
don't
good.
have, and we don't have the luxury of just being able to say, this is what I'm starting with, unless you play with Veers, but that's a different thing entirely.
Who I did just add to our unit list that we had forgotten. But that's exactly right, though. There's a lot of really great openings in this game, and we've seen a couple times where a very strong list is able to take a particular mission. In a lot of cases, it's been shifting priorities because of a guaranteed midline of objectives. It's able to take advantage of that and have a really great opening. But most of the time, with a couple exceptions, that is a lot of variance on whether that happens or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have that guaranteed game plan, but you can have backup game plans and backup game plans and what you want and what you don't kind of on different mission sets. So while I think it does take away from that overall aspect of I'm going into each game with a set plan on this is what I'm going to do, I think on the flip side, I think it opens up a level of strategy on adapting to the circumstances the game has provided to you and making the best play you can with what you were given. And to me, this is one of the main things, it might be the thing that makes Shatterpoint truly special. I think there's a combination of some other aspects, but this is one of the big ones where I think those moment-to-moment decision-making, solving the puzzle or seeing the pattern or the way to achieve the objective you're looking to get very quickly on card flip. And that is a big part of what you get out of reps with this game. I would say it's a big measurement of player skill in Shatterpoint is the ability to see those plays with the hand you've been dealt.
Yeah, and I think it's why Shatterpoint kind of exemplifies that whole saying of no plan survives contact with the enemy, because it's really true in this game where you can't plan. You can have, I shouldn't say you can't plan. Your plans can't be the same thing every time. Rather than having one line of play that you have to consider, you're instead coming up with, say, 7 different lines of play for your first turn. And then beyond that, you have to come up with different options, different variations. And you can have a basic outline, you can have a strategy, but your tactics have to change on the fly.
Yeah, like I think most of the time, if you have the reps with the list and practice with the list, you should have a general idea of, okay, if I flip this, this is what I'm going to do. If I flip this, this is what I'm going to do. And all of that immediately changes as soon as your opponent's made a move before you. So all that planning and practice can go a little ways, and you can practice openings, especially when going first. And I highly recommend people do that. But the moment you're going second, or what does the terrain look like, or all these other variances that can absolutely force you to adapt to kind of what the table and what the deck has given you. And I think we've really seen list building in Shatterpoint evolve since the early days as people kind of started to figure this out. And looking at your deck and the units that you're taking in your overall squads and saying, okay, how impactful is this if it's alone? How impactful is this unit when they activate if it has a pin or a strain at the start of its turn? And really leaning towards units that are a little more independent or can still act on their own if they don't have that support around them that they need. And there's a lot more complexities that go into those choices. But overall, the concept is avoiding bad activations.
Yep. And that's a big part of the game, is seeing when your opponent has only, say, 3 cards left in the deck, and you know how to make those activations bad, or you trying to avoid those bad activations yourself. It's a big part of the strategy of the game that is a layer or two deeper than just, I need to get on a point and potentially kill something. And I think that's really what divides the really experienced players from the less experienced players. And it's something you can really work on. Is a talent that you can develop.
Yeah, it's, again, I touched on this already briefly, but it is one of the biggest signs of just reps with the game. And especially early on, and I feel like this chatter around this particular concept has definitely died down a bit as the game's matured and as has the community and the advice out there and overall player skill. But used to hear a lot on, I lost because of a bad order deck. And that is absolutely something that, yeah, you can have some bad order deck variants. That's absolutely true. But I find a lot of the times when that's an extreme example, that is due to either misplays leading up to that moment and not planning around what's in the deck, what do I have remaining, how do I make sure that those activations are shored up to be successful, or a problem in list building in the first place. And both of those, again, I think has definitely gotten better over time. I certainly hear less of that as Shatterpoint's gone on. But was a lot of conversation early on. And I think it really is something that doesn't get better unless you have the reps, you have the time. But to hopefully try to speed that up a little bit for some listeners here that might be newer or trying to hit that next level of play, what are some ways that you can mitigate that variance and kind of take control of the uncontrollable aspect?
So I kind of would divide this into 2 different categories. The first would be in-game actions you can take, things you can do during the game, and then list building, where whether it's taking advantage of units or mechanics that directly affect the order deck, or just in terms of building your list in a way where you don't have those dead draws. So for in-game stuff, one thing I would say is very much you want to be constantly checking what you have left in your deck. Like, that would be the first thing. Also checking what your opponent has left in their deck.
Yes.
Being aware of what can still activate and what can't still activate can really inform your plays. In terms of one thing with, say, units that can move someone else. If something is coming up and is out of position, you know it'll be a bad activation, but you don't know where in the deck it is. That is a high priority unit for you to move with a tactic. Say I pull Rex. Rex is kind of the classic core set example where he gets to move someone else. And say I have Ahsoka 1. She's still back in deployment. There's no points for her to get to. It might be worth sending her up a little bit so that her turn isn't dead. you want to be able to move her forward a little bit to get her in a position where her activation can do something. Because otherwise, you're essentially just giving your opponent a free turn. Alternatively, if you have a unit that you know can't activate, and they're near a point but aren't contesting or anything, they are also a high priority to move because they can get on that point and are relevant in the game. Because as it stands, if they have already activated, you still have 3 or 4 cards left to go before you shuffle up your deck, and they're not on a point, they're not doing anything, barring some abilities and stuff. So just being aware of what your units are doing on the table with respect to whether or not they have activated or not, that's a huge thing in terms of in-game awareness, in terms of being able to take advantage of everything you have.
Part of that can go into kind of that planning phase, right? Where you can't guarantee what's going to happen first or in what order, but you can go in with a plan with your list of, okay, here's some slower things in my list. I look at some very easy Republic examples where you look at things like Luminara, Obi-Wan, even Kiadi-Mundi, characters that need to get into melee, only have a jump or dash that's accessible to them along with their full advanced movement action. These characters are going to be far more impactful if they're able to get a dash or an advance before they activate. So setting up those primaries to be able to have the activation they need. And I think this is something, especially with the movement, that you need to be more conscious of when you have melee only activations. Because if that character can't get into melee, they're likely going to have a poor activation. Now, there's some other mechanics you can add in to give them some other things to do instead of just melee. But I think as a general idea, you want to make sure that your melee characters can get to the points they need to impact. Another thing that I think, is really order deck dependent on what do I have to go and how do I shore up the rest of my activations. And Titus, this is one of your favorite parts of Shatterpoint is heals. If you've got a character that has heals on their attack tree or other ways where they can remove conditions or heal a unit at a certain distance, you want to prioritize activations that are coming up soon. That's going to free, if you've got that pin, that strain, that disarm, that's going to lead to a more negative activation coming up. How can I, in this activation, heal that character up so they're going to have a good activation next? And there's a balance there that you need to find on, am I making this activation worse to make that one better? But I think there's a sweet spot there that you really need to be able to find. And that all those pieces come down, Titus, to exactly what you said. It's knowing what you have coming left, and knowing what your opponent has left, because realistically, what your opponent has left are the tools that they have to be able to take your objectives. And if you're able to throw conditions on them, like those pins, those strains, those disarms, to make their upcoming activations potentially worse, well, that's how you gain the small measurements that lead to winning a game, right?
Yep. Now, there's a mechanic that everybody has access to, no matter what the list, that is meant to help us mitigate this, and that's the reserve mechanic. I should say, not necessarily no matter the list, there's a few units you can't reserve, but in general, you can choose to spend a force to put a card aside and leave that for a later time. This mechanic does interact with a lot of units in interesting ways, but at its core, the idea is to help you put off an activation in favor of another one. This is knowing when to reserve is a big thing, and it's a very common question that not just we get, but also anyone who's talking about Shatterpoint is probably going to run into at some point, because it's a tough thing. Especially when you're spending a force. There's times when it's more or less, which makes the question even harder. So I'm trying to think of where to even start with how to decide on the reserve, because it's very much dependent on your list. There's always going to be some things in your list that are better early, better late, and it's very list dependent.
I think at its core, the decision to reserve comes down to a very simple question. Can this activation flip me a point this turn?
I'd agree.
That's it. I think there's obviously some complexities and some nuances to that overall. asking yourself, can another activation that I might flip me a point this turn? Because it's not just no, then do it. But I think at its core, that is a decision you're making when you flip that card, is whether this is an optimal activation or not, because force is a resource, and force economy, I feel like we could do a whole other episode on. So I won't dive too deep into that here, but you are taking away the ability for one of your units to do something by spending the force to reserve. You are very potentially, and I've certainly seen this play out in enough games to know that you are, in a lot of cases, especially with a lot of the lists these days are running that 5 force 6 in a good case scenario. You are making one of your later activations intentionally worse by choosing to reserve this, and that trade-off has to be worth it. Yeah. And sometimes it is. If I don't do something right now, I'm going to lose this struggle or potentially lose the game. Yeah, absolutely. Spend that force, put that card in reserve, and go for that better activation that's going to keep you playing and keep fighting for that struggle or for that win. If you're in a circumstance where, hey, I've got a decent lead here, maybe I don't need to spend this, even though this isn't an ideal activation, take the activation and do what you can with it, right? Don't just spend force because the activation is a little uncomfortable. Sometimes that's okay. Unless your list has an abundance of force, and then do whatever you want. That's what it's for.
Yeah. So I got a couple different points I want to touch on. The first would be that you hear from a certain subset of players the recurring frame of I never reserve. You could play the game just fine without reserving. And I mean, some very good players play that way, where they never even consider reserving unless it's like the worst case of worst cases. I personally think that is the wrong approach to take, but some people make it work. And it comes very much down to play style. Some people put a lot of work into figuring out how they can get away without that. And part of that is list building. Part of that is just experience with making the best of a bad situation. I don't think you should be scared to reserve. I don't think you should look at yourself as a bad player if you find you have to reserve. It is a
completely agree
mechanic in the game for a reason. And depending on the list, you might need it more or less. Don't be discouraged by hearing those people saying, good players don't reserve, because it's not true. There are plenty of good players that use the reserve mechanic. There are mechanics that are around, specifically built around the reserving. So it's part of the game for a reason. The other thing I want to really go over is I kind of have a personal checklist in terms of deciding when to reserve. The force, for me, is a lot less of a consideration than I believe it is with you, Kyle, but it is still something. The main things I'm thinking of is when I look at the card that I've drawn and then what's left in the deck, I'm more considering how many activations that are in the deck are better than the one that I currently have. And am I satisfied with the one that is here? Because obviously I don't want to sacrifice force needlessly just to get a slightly better activation. It needs to be a significant advantage. The second point that I then think of is, can I stay in the game with the activation that I have drawn? If there is, like, if you just lose the game with that activation and any of the activations in your deck can do better, then that's when you really end up wanting to reserve. Obviously, there's no black and white. So often it'll be, okay, this activation is really bad and I have to rely on dice. I could theoretically stay in the game, but it's not likely. Then you're looking at, okay, well, what's the chance that I draw something better? Say I have 4 cards left in the deck and only one of them is better. Well, maybe I'd be better off just trying to do my best with what I've got, with the known quantity. But if 3 of the 4 or even 4 of the 4 are better, then it's a lot more appealing to make that trade. And then that's kind of where the math of it really comes into play, where you're going, okay, well, this is a bad play and the dice give me a low chance of scoring, but say it's a 20% chance that I actually get something better. Well, obviously you're not doing full probability calculations in your head at the table, but you should have kind of an idea of the chance of me getting a better activation is lower than the chance of this activation just doing what I need it to do.
Sorry, we're not doing probability calculations at the table.
I mean, with the low numbers we're working with,
It's
you
definitely doable.
can, some people can, but us mere mortals that need to pull out a calculator every now and again might not want to take the time. But
No,
that's why
I
you
think
kind of have
just to touch
these
on
rules
that.
of thumb. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I think part of that is to touch on the force point again and to kind of go back to our earlier point of a big part of using reserve well and managing your order deck well is knowing what activations you have left in deck. And every time I consider reserving, I'll go through, these are all the cards I have in deck. These are the ones that absolutely need a force on their activation to do what they need to do. I have 5 force left. Use Mandalorians as an example because it's always easy. I got 4 force left, but I've got coverts that are going to need a jump. I've got Clan Kreese that's going to need a jump. Armor is going to need some extra movement. Okay, I have to spend 3. I've got 4. How many other cards are there, and do I have the ability to even spend this? I think part of that is knowing your list, knowing how much force each unit left is going to need to spend. And kind of as I'm going through that, I think I reserve late in my order deck more often than I reserve early as I'm playing this out in my head, because you're playing with less variance, right? If you have 3 cards left in deck, you draw for turn. This is what I have. I know if I reserve this card, it's either this or it's this. And that's a better educated decision to make than your first turn. And you're like, maybe that's not an ideal flip. And you've got 6 other things that card can be. So I think just being aware of that probability and of that variance, and I think it's more controllable as you get kind of near the bottom of that deck. And it's a lot easier at that point to say, I've got 3 force left. One of these activations doesn't need any. So I actually have this to spend right now, even if this is not a bad activation, but it's not ideal, but I just have the force to spend and I can definitely get a better turn without them. Another one I want to touch on kind of as the final point before we get to list building is there are times where you want to reserve not because you're going to have a bad activation, but because it's a better threat in reserve. And I look at Vader 1 Jedi Hunter as one of my best examples of that. I think Anakin falls under that kind of space as well, where a lot of times those two will be able to have a pretty good activation on their own, but they can have some pretty explosive turns if they have the right target in the right spot and can just kind of control an area of the board because their activation's coming up and when they activate, they're absolutely going to secure a wound.
Yep.
And
I
that
think
can
that's a
be an
very good
interesting
point.
threat. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not something I was necessarily thinking about, but being able to have that threatening character just always on the cusp of I could activate this if you put anything near it means that you've basically cordoned off an entire area of the board and said, come here at your own peril, which it's back to a thing we talked about like months and months ago about threat of activation when we were talking about OB2, where there's certain abilities where basically trying to play around it is an advantage all of its own for you. This is kind of the same thing where if people are saying, okay, I'm not going to go near Vader, I'm not going to go near Anakin because as soon as they do, they're going to activate and kill the thing. You as the Anakin or Vader player say, okay, anything that's near Anakin or Vader are probably safe now. So you can be a little more aggressive. You can be a little more, put things on a more dangerous spot because you can retaliate when needed. And all you did was put something in reserve. You're going to activate it eventually anyway, but you just have that card facing your opponent and they know it's there.
Yeah, it can dictate a choice. And do I wound that thing? Because if I wound that thing, you're immediately able to just wake it back up. And it's this threat that you can create from reserve that definitely has a level of mind games that you can play with your opponent on threatening a piece of the board. And is it worth taking this objective? Am I putting myself too extended by taking this? And then just next turn, you're able to activate them, whatever you had in reserve, and take it back immediately. Is it worth even making that play? And I think these are really good questions. And As we kind of transition, I think those kind of units that have that kind of threat power are definitely a part of list building in Shatterpoint. And I think, Titus, you mentioned it there. I've definitely heard the same kind of commentary on, I never reserve or I rarely reserve. And I think part of that's part of the benefit you get from like truly optimized lists, right?
I have one more thing I'd like to cover before we get to list building.
Yes.
And that would be reserving around struggle transitions, because there's kind of two things that can come up when you're getting near the end of a struggle.
I already agree. I'm in.
So basically, you say you're coming up on a struggle transition. I win or lose, but you know the struggle is going to end soon. There's two things that I find come up frequently where that will influence whether or not you reserve. One is if you draw a card that you know is going to be a very strong activation, but you know you've already won the struggle with fairly low amount of effort on this last activation. It might be good to reserve that thing, whether it's Kiadi, Shock T for displacement type stuff, or you've got something like it's like an Iden where you're going to kill something and move a bunch of things. Stuff like that, where it's a high impact activation and you don't necessarily need that power level to close the struggle. You can often reserve that knowing, okay, first activation, next struggle is going to be very, very strong and potentially get me an advantage in the next struggle. The other thing that I've seen is kind of the mirror of that, where you draw a really bad activation and you know the struggle is going to change soon, whether it's, oh, I've got this wrapped up, or my opponent is got this almost guaranteed no matter what I do. Often you'll take that bad activation in order to just get it out of your deck and know that the rest of the deck is going to be stronger, or at least likely stronger. This is your stuff like Stormtrooper Sergeant, where it's a good support unit but doesn't necessarily have great activations. Luminara is another good one. Stuff like that, where it's this unit is in the deck, like in your list for other things it does other than its activation. I just need a good time to use this. And if the struggle's a foregone conclusion, again, in either direction, you're not going to reserve that late in the struggle because you want better activations next struggle. There's no point in trying to push your advantage now.
On a similar note, and we didn't really touch on, but I think the same thing exactly for both of those scenarios applies to shuffling the Shatterpoint back into the deck, because you don't want to A, burn the Shatterpoint on a struggle you're already winning, or B, burn the Shatterpoint on a struggle you're already going to lose. You want that to be impactful for going into that next struggle. That might be one of the most common times I'll spend a force, is when I know I'm going to need that Shatterpoint card in the next struggle. Awesome. So, list building to kind of list building to mitigate some of that variance. And I think we touched on this a little bit already, but I think it starts with strong activations. You want to look at in a vacuum, this character is able to do what I need it to do reliably, whether that is wound an enemy unit, whether that is get to the point that it needs to take, be able to displace something, be able to shove something. You're looking for units that can reliably do the thing that they need to do in a way that they're not often going to be a dead draw or a bad activation. A lot of those are going to have, and one of the biggest things I think helps mitigate that is units that have some way to move themselves on their own, in addition to their move action. Because if you go into an activation and you're pinned and you don't have a dash or an advance or some ability that gives you a way to shake off that pin, you're just standing there hoping it goes well. Look at Magnagard in a modern sense are one of the best examples of a card that can very frequently be a dead draw, because if Magnagard are pinned, you now have one movement you're basically making with them, or you're taking a recover action and they both get to do a single advance. But in a lot of cases, that's simply not enough on a turn. And we've seen, I think, a decent amount of times now that units that can't do this kind of thing simply don't make it in any sort of competitive level.
Yeah. And I would like to throw out there that On a very similar note, things that can clear conditions on their activation. The
Real good.
ISF is a big one, but also things like Bosk or Vader 3, things that even Baze
Padawans.
and Shrew, things that are able to clear a pin or a strain, especially disarm even. They can get rid of those conditions when they activate are rarely dead draws in comparison to things that just kind of are stuck with it. So, and it's similar to that movement, but a little more flexible, in my opinion.
This is going to touch on that force economy conversation that I said I wasn't going to dive into again. But activations that don't require you to spend force when they activate, while may not get around mitigating the order deck themselves, they free up the ability to do things like take a reserve. Or, hey, I'm out of force and near the end of my deck. Well, this is still going to be a good activation because this unit doesn't require force to do its thing. And I think having 1 to 2 things in your deck that don't require force on their activation to have a good activation has become a base requirement of list building.
Another principle that I think is very important in terms of dealing with the variance in the order deck is something that is very much from the more TCG realm of deck building, which is having redundancy in what is in your deck. So in like trading card games, you do this by having multiple copies of a specific card, often having multiple cards that do a similar effect. We're looking at kind of the same thing where you want to have, like, if you have a specific game plan, say your game plan is to have a very explosive, highly mobile starting turn. It's good to have multiple characters that can enable that. So my example would be you're trying to get that explosive opener with an Iden list. Well, it's very useful to have Iden, but also have something that can move multiple bodies in the form of DTE. The Death Trooper Escort moves 2 supports, well, like 1 support unit.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Itself. You can also have Stormtrooper Sergeant, which again moves 2 support bodies from the same unit and himself. You're going from an opener that would initially be, say, 3, 4 if you count the Shatter Point of your 7 cards, instead of just Iden, which would be 1, 2 if you count the Shatter Point. That makes your odds so much more likely, because if you look at 2 of 7, that's like 28% chance. But if you have 4 of your potential activations can do this, that's over half your list. It's 50% or higher. So having redundancy in terms of what you've brought can really up the chances of you doing your game plan.
Yeah, I think, and there's a few great examples of it, and obviously, like, mobility is definitely one of them. I think another great example is diceless displacement. Like, having 1 character in your list that can do this is, well, I have this thing that I can't really shove, I can't really get to, and displacement is my only way to solve this problem. And if you've only got 1 answer to that in your deck to the exact same point, but if it's a core part of what you're trying to accomplish in this list, going to 3 units, even 4 units that have a form of displacement, like some of the Jedi lists do, this becomes now a core part of the game plan, and more often than not, something that you flip is able to do exactly that. Even just a wound style game plan of my main way to get my opponent's models off of points is to, you want to go and have, okay, well, every unit in my list at baseline should be able to wound a support. Is kind of how you go into planning that. Again, the same thing applies to revenge triggers. Revenge triggers are more reliable when you have 2 to 3 of them in the list versus only having 1. But having that cohesive kind of idea of what your list is trying to do means you're more reliably going to run into those options. I think that's a great call out.
Yep. Likewise, you don't want to have too many support units in terms of building your list. It's okay to have 1 or 2. 1, I think, is kind of the sweet spot for, like, things, again, like Stormtrooper Sergeant or Luminara or Veers, things like that, where they don't have great activations, But between having the redundancy in your deck where you have those regular, fairly reliable activations and the reserve, which is why I kind of say having one support unit is kind of the sweet spot. Because if you know this reserve is always reserved for this one particular unit, it's a lot easier to plan for. And say like you draw that thing early, you can choose to just go with it if it's okay, because like anyone can get to a point on their first activation. But it's I'm trying to think of where I was going with this.
Yeah, so for me, that this comes down to a list building fundamental that I think I've kind of adopted since very early in Shatterpoint, which is my limit on units that I believe can be somewhat frequent to frequent dead draws is 1. I am willing to put 1 unit in my deck that, based on circumstances, can frequently be a dead draw, because I know at the very least I have 1 reserve slot where I can put them. If I flip them first, if they need to be enabled before they can go, I can put that into reserve. If I flip them when they're conditioned, I can put that into reserve. And I know, kind of going into those style of lists, that reserve spot is more or less for that unit. Again, I already touched on Magna Guard, but anytime I'm putting Magna Guard on the table, that reserve spot stays open if Magna Guard are still in deck, because there are a lot of ways that I can clear conditions off of them, but I need the opportunity to do that. Another good example, because I've been looking at Ewoks a lot lately, I think 3PO and R2 after rework are an incredible support character in those lists, but also an activation that can be very bad when you need to do something on the table and make an impact. And I think, you've mentioned Stormtrooper Sergeant a few times, and I think that's another great example. A lot of your 3-cost secondaries, I think, in a lot of ways, fit into this category where maybe they move something, maybe they have an aura that does something nice for your team, but are very more likely to be that dead draw on your team when you need a really impactful turn.
Yep. Now the question that it begs the question, why would we take any dead draws at all? Which, to my answer, would be the support units can still bring something very important to the table. Again, I keep hammering back at Stormtrooper Sergeant, but if you're going with a Stormtrooper list, that coordinated offensive can be a huge damage multiplier. Same thing with, say, No Sarai or Fixer. I mean, Fixer's not really a dead draw, but the idea is you get these support units, they make your list a lot stronger as a whole. Their own activations might not be great, but if it makes your other activations better,
they make every other activation more impactful, which overall can be worth it.
So it's not to say you never take something that would be a dead draw. You just don't want to have too many of them, because if you go all in on support characters, hoping that, okay, my 2 primaries and say one of my supports are going to carry the entire list, it can happen in some games if you have it spread out evenly throughout your deck. But if you say okay, I start the game, both primaries and the support, and then you realize everything left in the deck is a bad activation, that gives your opponent a lot of time to take the struggle before you're able to respond to that.
Yeah, like you never want to, I don't know, say reserve No Sarai and flip it into a pinned Kalani, because wow, you've lost the struggle. You've just lost a struggle in a lot of cases there. So I think just having that awareness, again, this comes back to the core point. And the best way to manage that order deck is to know what's left in your deck and make those informed decisions on when you're reserving of, is this worse than the worst case scenario that I could flip? And that's, I think, how your best way to mitigate those dead draws or lacking activations. Now, there are also some units in the game that play with the order deck, that play with the reserve mechanic in some different categories of ways, but there's some pretty unique abilities in the game, and I expect that we're going to continue to see AMG play with this more in the design space as, we get deeper into Shatterpoint and more releases come out. And I'm personally excited for that, because again, I think just like I really like when they play around with the hunker mechanics, I really like this one because it's something that they get to play around with. It's truly unique to this game, where you get to see really good innovation in a game design space. So And we've seen characters that touch this kind of since the beginning. Kalani, I think, is the only thing in the core box, unless I'm missing anything. Kalani and the B1. So kind of that squad was kind of the first mechanics we saw with that. So kind of let's touch on Separatists first, because I think Separatists play with this more than any other faction tag.
Yes, the
right?
Separatists are very concerned with their order deck. And I think that
especially
that's reflected,
now.
Yeah, it's reflected in the fact that they do have some really bad activations on units that are otherwise able to contribute quite a bit. So like you have Kalani and Kraken, who are free reserves. They don't affect anything else, but when you draw them, it's free to put them in reserve. You don't have to spend any force.
So an acknowledgement that, hey, sometimes these might not be your optimal activations, but because of that, and they're tactical droids, and they know, hey, it's not the best time for me to go right now, and they prepared for that, throw them in reserve for free.
The other thing Separatists do really well is taking a card that you are putting in reserve and putting it back into the deck. You have the B1s who do this to themselves. You have No Rai and the Aqua Droids, who both are able to tuck units with certain tags on the bottom of the deck and put themselves into reserve. And all this kind of adds up to the Separatists having very good order control, because you can go 2 or 3 units down into your deck and just keep digging through until you get that thing you want. But you have to build your deck accordingly.
It's a super fun mechanic, and I think you can build that list to take advantage of this kind of at its highest point. If you go full Rift box with one of the tactical droids on the other side with the B1s, you have some sort of order deck control on basically every activation other than one primary, which I think is very cool. Now, we've seen some cool mechanics in Republic as well, and again, this is definitely something that was played with decently in kind of that first year of Shatterpoint, where we got Jedi Luminara and General Kenobi, both which play with the reserve mechanic in some very unique ways to the two of them. Now, Obi was very unique, and kind of No Sarai's kind of come in and done very similar to what Obi can do, which is, hey, I've got a card in reserve, a flip Obi, I'm able to put Obi in reserve and then choose to put that card as a top or bottom of my deck. And this can play with the probability in some really unique ways. I know for me, and everyone is aware that I play a ton of General Kenobi. This is one of my reasonings, and one of my favorite things about him is really just playing with that variance, because I'm far more likely to take an early reserve in a list with Kenobi than I am elsewhere, because I know I'm going to get the best use out of Kenobi by having something in reserve when he flips. So recently, that's been a lot of Boss and Obi together. If I get that first turn fixer, which is the first turn dead-ish draw that I don't want compared to the rest of the order deck, no problem. I can reserve that, and at some point, that's going to allow Kenobi to jump when he does the whole flip here. Luminara is a unique one, and Flow the Force I still think is one of the coolest identities in all of Shatterpoint. Titus, I will pass this over to you, because you've certainly played more Lumi than I have.
I've played a ton of Lumi. Flow of the Force does a lot of things. We won't go over everything, but the one that's important for today is it lets you, while you are in the phase where you pick a card from the top of your deck, or you pick your reserve, you are allowed to peek at the top of your deck, which no one else can do. So before you decide, am I going to go with the reserve unit, or am I going to take the top card, Lumi lets you look. This doesn't necessarily seem huge, but you're making a choice with full knowledge rather than looking at probabilities. So again, say I have a card in reserve, and then I have 3 cards left in my deck. Normally, you go, okay, what are the 3 activations left? I have a 1 in 3 chance of drawing any of them, which if all 3 of those activations are good, no problem. But say I have 2 very good activations, and one of the last one is a pinned Magna Guard, which that pinned Magna Guard is a really bad activation, and you know that, but the other 2 might still be good. Lumi lets you just look at the top card and go, okay, it's the Magna Guard. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go with the reserve card. Or I know it's not the Magna Guard. It's say Django. Well, at that point, you get to make that informed decision and know that the activation is not going to be dead. Having 100% foreknowledge is very useful. And while it doesn't give you any kind of numerical or mechanical advantages on the table, it can still win you a game because you don't have to put mental effort into figuring out what that card is. You don't have to put any mental strain into deciding whether or not it's the right call. You just go, okay, is it unit A or unit B? And you just look at those two and go, okay, I know which one's better. They're fairly similar, so maybe it's best to take the reserve card because then it frees it up for making a choice later on, that kind of stuff.
Lumi's cool. Lumi's a cool primary. I will touch
I
on
think
like
she's great.
I like Flow of the Force. I think every ability in Flow of the Force touches on this in a little bit, but a little more nuanced for the rest of them. I think the Dash on Wound is just overall improving the rest of your activations in your list. And again, that can help clear pins and have units ready to activate. The heals, when you're wounded, do the exact same thing. You're clearing conditions, you're clearing damage to have fresh activations ready to go. And, you know, the full heal on Lumi's card, I think just about everything Luminar is doing on that card is saying, hey, I'm going to make sure you have good activations for the rest of your list. And that's going to mitigate dead draws. It's going to mitigate now herself be one of the worst dead draws that you can get in the game. So you're playing with some variance on your own there. And I think to be able to look at the next card, you have to have something in reserve. And I think like Lumi herself is probably the most common thing you're going to have in reserve to make sure that you have access to that ability. So it's a give or take.
Yeah. So next up, I would go to kind of the Empire faction because they don't concern themselves quite as much with, they concern themselves with what's in the reserve field more so than really changing your order deck. They don't care so much about the order deck, they care more about the reserve. So you have things like Thrawn, where he lets you reserve for free. And then when you reserve things, you can spend force to move them. You have Veers, which puts something in reserve at the start of the game. And if a Stormtrooper is in reserve, they get extra defense dice. Stuff like that. I would also say some of the Force regen from Grand Inquisitor and Vader 3 also help with those reserve things because they give you the Force to spend on that. And then finally you have Moff Gideon, who on the flip side taxes your opponent's reserve, making it much more awkward for them to reserve things.
Yeah, Moff is an interesting one because I would put that in a near top identity in the game.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that doesn't always feel super impactful when you're playing it, but when you're the opponent, you feel super constrained as if this option has just been taken away from you. But the one I want to talk about most
of times, my opponent has gone, I'm going to reserve. And I go, that's going to cost 2. And they go, I'm not reserving. That right there tells me the ability is doing work. It is doing something because they were going to reserve, and now they're taking a bad activation. And I know it's a bad activation because they were going to reserve it.
Yeah, that's great. Veers is the one I want to talk about and hit on here the most, though, because Veers is the most order deck manipulation that we have in Shatterpoint. This allows you on first turn to guarantee a first turn activation with something. And if the cost of taking Veers wasn't so great, this could very well be one of the best abilities in Shatterpoint. And I frankly would be nervous if Veers was a strong competitive primary with that ability, because I think it can just open up some really problematic things. From an advantage standpoint, I can have the perfect first turn and you don't get that opportunity. When I first read Veers, my initial take was this is busted. The rest of the card clearly doesn't match the power of that ability. And I think part of that is the balancing act, right? But this is the thing that has always drawn me to Veers. We saw a period of time where Veers taken alongside Inferno Squad was able to get this kind of perfect opening set up with Death Trooper Escort or Stormtrooper Sergeant and able to move that support and, on a mission like Shifting Priorities, guaranteed taking the full midline on first turn, which can completely change the dynamic of a game.
Yep. Yeah, like it's a very interesting play style, and I think he's very interesting in that he also does care later in the game about what's in reserve. I've been playing a lot of him recently, so like he's top of mind,
yes.
and he's very cool. Sorry, going on, I think Rebels and Scoundrels kind of have a lot of overlap in terms of the last little bit of order deck manipulation, in that they don't have a lot. You have Dengar, who lets you reserve bounty hunters for free. But apart from that, neither of those factions really interact with the order deck a lot. What they do have is a lot of units that care about when they activate and want to be in reserve, or don't necessarily want to be in reserve, as the case may be. You have things like Lando and R2, or what's the other one? The
Jedi Luke.
Chopper and Jedi Luke, who all kind of benefit from being in reserve. With Chopper and Lando and R2 is because they can't be shot when they're in the deck or in reserve. Well, you can't necessarily guarantee they're going to stay in the deck, but if you put them into reserve early, they're going to stay there until the last activation. They take their turn, and they can be shot for the duration of their turn. Then you shuffle the deck and suddenly they can't be shot again. Jedi Luke, he doesn't have anything on his card that specifically calls out being in reserve, but his immunity bubble gets the benefit of both immunities only when he's in reserve. So it can be beneficial to throw him in reserve early, because then he's doing twice the work with that ability. On the Scoundrel side, you have, say, Hondo is one that doesn't say a whole lot about reserving on his card, and when it does, it's about your opponent. Yeah, it's about your opponent.
I literally forget that exists, and I played a lot of Hondo.
But what I was actually thinking of is his tactic. Gives you force back based on the amount of points your opponent has. Well, you don't want that to open a struggle, because your opponent has no objectives claimed, and you also don't necessarily want it when you're in the lead. So it's very common to reserve him until it would be advantageous to go with him. And then on the flip side there, you have Lando Calrissian, who you almost never want to put in reserve, and he really cares about when he comes out of your deck. And if he comes out at the right time, he's great. If he comes out at a bad time, he's awful. So like Scoundrels play a lot with the order deck, but it's more of a gambling sort of thing where they're like, yeah, we can't mitigate this at all. We don't do a whole lot to change this. But if you luck out, we can be very, very strong in terms of when they activate.
Is thematic, right?
Yeah, it's very thematic.
So the last piece and our latest mission set, First Contact, also touches a very cool thing when it comes to the order deck and reserve. So each of Struggle 1 on First Contact has 3 options for your clever ploy. So when the shatter point happens, both you and your opponent get to do something. And one of those options on the card is to pull something out of your deck and put it into reserve. To me, this is my favorite part of First Contact, the clever ploy mechanic as a whole, but this ability in particular, to a point that I think you can list build for First Contact with the intent of this ability. I love General Kenobi here. I think Luke can have a guaranteed impact on here. I like Hondo on First Contact because it puts me in control of when he's going to flip to refresh the force. Even just the refresh force clever ploy, and similar on Sabotage, but like that's not a guaranteed thing that might ever pop up in a game, where with First Contact it's guaranteed. That is just this mission can impact it. And I think part of that's by cool design, because I think I probably reserve on First Contact more than any other mission. Either based on someone not being able to reach an objective, or I'm in struggle 2 or 3 and I need someone that can flip a point and wound something to kind of stay ahead in the struggle, and I'm looking for that right activation. I think I can pretty confidently say I reserve more on First Contact than than anywhere else. And I think it's just a cool part of the mission design.
Yeah. And you also probably shuffle the Shatterpoint card back in a lot more than any other mission, because you actually have to be careful about when you do your Shatterpoint, because your opponent can benefit from it.
Can this give my opponent too big of an advantage right now? Okay, maybe that Shatterpoint waits for later.
One other thing I would like to touch on would be something that seems like it would affect the order deck a lot more than I think it actually does, which is battle tactics. You have Thrawn, who puts in 2 battle tactics of his 3 options, and you have the Ewok trappers that put in their
the
trap
card.
It seems on face value that this would change the order deck a lot, because you're putting a battle tactic into the order deck. That means more cards. It changes the probability, right? But as soon as you draw those cards, you do the effect and then you jump to the next card. So it's very much like in TCGs, where you have cards that just draw another one, and often people just don't even necessarily consider those to be a card in their deck. It's thinning their deck out. It's the same thing with this. You're putting a card in there, but functionally it doesn't change the math at all, because you're just doing the ability and moving on to the next one. So while yes, you have a 9-card deck, you can still consider it to be a 7-card deck in terms of when you're looking at the math for your units. The only drawback really is with Thrawn's battle tactics. It gives you 2 options. If you take the bottom option, you're essentially waiving your ability to reserve. When you draw the next card, no, you're not. You're waiving your ability to pick the card that is in reserve. So if you take the bottom option, you are essentially saying, I have to take the top card of my deck. You can't take the reserved unit, which can be a factor, but it's fairly minimal compared to adding a full unit to your deck. It doesn't quite work out in terms of changing the math.
You always get to draw the next card. You're getting advantages as you go through your order deck, but it doesn't actually change, to your point, doesn't change probability. It doesn't change the likelihood of a unit coming up or not. But to the point of getting cleaner activations, you are able to put things in the right spots. You're able to clear pins as you go through Thrawn's battle tactics, or potentially give your opponent worse activations with the Ewok Trapper card. I say potentially because there's a lot of variance to that one.
They have a pretty good chance of pinning. It's fairly reliable.
I think 2 more small notes on interesting characters that touch the order deck, and one is going back to Thrawn for a 3rd time here. And the one I just forget that Thrawn even does, but Thrawn has circumstances that allow you to shuffle your whole deck back up.
Right, yep. I've built whole lists around that, and I still forget about it.
Yeah, so I think it's when a primary is wounded, right?
Yep. When a primary is wounded, I believe, by an attack.
When a primary is wounded by an enemy attack, after the effect is resolved, you may refresh your order decks. And the may is very nice there, because you can kind of look at what's left, where your force is at, and make the choice on whether you want to do that or not. The other one I will touch on is Vader per servant, which also has a unique mechanic with the order deck, where if Vader fails to wound an enemy unit on his activation, Vader's card goes back into the order deck. This can actually lead to some pretty unique scenarios where Vader has to activate over and over if he's failing to wound, which, to be clear, he does not often do. He's pretty good at that.
Yeah, but occasionally your dice are bad.
But there's also times where you may not want to get the wound through because you want to be able to activate Vader again. So this is another way where you can kind of manipulate that order deck.
I also enjoy going first activation with him, because you can just go, okay, I'm going to take him, I'm going to stick him on a midline point, and then I'm going to pretend that actually you're first player, and I just start with Vader on a point, because he shovels him back into the deck.
You have this midline Vader threat to add to the puzzle. Yeah, I think that's about it. Now there's a couple other small things. Django can attack something when it's used from reserve. There's a couple other small things that touch. Yeah, Grief Karga, but overall, I think we see incredible abilities across this game where, from a design perspective, AMG is really playing around with this unique part of Shatterpoint and building some real character in some units by by leveraging it. Again, I said this early on in this conversation, but this is, I think, one of the main selling points for Shatterpoint for me. I think it's incredibly unique from a miniatures space and definitely changes the game from I'm going in with this set game plan to I need to be able to think on my feet and solve the puzzle that's presented to me every single turn. One thing that we didn't touch on, but deciding when to reserve or going with the unit that you flipped, or deciding when to activate the unit that you do have in reserve is a pretty key decision point at the beginning of every turn. And I find one of the most common where decision making can kind of stall out for a second, especially for a newer player or a pretty tense scenario where we're close to game end or struggle end and we're trying to make the most impactful decisions that we can. One thing I generally recommend, other than combat phases where you're rolling defense dice, there isn't a crazy amount in Shatterpoint that you make decisions or have to do things during your opponent's turn. And as just a general recommendation for keeping good time in a game, for managing kind of your expectations of what your next turn is going to look like, spend your opponent's turn looking at the board, thinking about what activations you have left in your deck, and what would you do if you flipped any of them. And a lot of the times you can go into your turn with kind of that decision-making process already complete on if I flip this, I do this. If I flip this, I do this. If I flip this, it's definitely going into reserve. And you can kind of have those decision points kind of decided before you even get to the point of flipping your deck. And again, this is something that comes with time, practice, and the reps into a list to know, to kind of know what you would do. But I think it's one of the things that really is to take that next level in playing a list and playing a list really well is knowing those points and when you would make those choices.
I would second that. And also I would emphasize that even more when you have something in reserve. If you have a unit in reserve, always be thinking, okay, what can they do next turn? What can they do next turn? And sometimes that's just nothing. Sometimes that's, they're pinned, so until I can heal them, they're staying there. But be aware that that's there.
Awesome. Guys, that's the order deck. This has been requested a couple times by a few listeners on kind of when we throw out the idea of what should we cover next, or getting suggestions from other players. And I'm super happy with how this conversation turned out. I hope you guys are too. Titus and I kind of had a primary to jump into in case this wasn't a long enough conversation, but it turns out it absolutely was. So that primary can be saved for another day. But awesome. Share your thoughts on the order deck in Discord. We're always happy to jump into the conversation further. Share your thoughts around the order deck, changes you would make to the mechanic. Happy to chat through it. As always, the Discord link is in the show notes.
Yep. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask us too. That's always fun.
Yes.
I've been enjoying fielding some of those.
Awesome. Have a good night, everyone.
Have a good night.